Then it's put into the marketplace via the mortgage, via the business loan, or the government needing to borrow money for infrastructure projects like building a new tramway in a capital city or whatever. It's all put in there on the basis that it has to be repaid. And of course it has to be repaid with interest. So what we have is the bank putting loan capital into the economy, which has to then be paid with interest. And these guys are so good, they always make sure that the interest is greater than any growth in the economy. So even though there may appear to be growth in the economy, and what I'm going to show you later is that the Celtic tiger never existed. It was a complete myth which everybody bought into, especially the part of the myth that said that it was going to be permanent boom. The goal was to get everybody into debt, because the interest has to come out of the national wealth. So every year, the national wealth gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until basically the national wealth has been sucked dry, and now basically there's no more wealth, and all the wealth being generated by the country is not even enough to pay the interest on the loan. And that's been the situation in the United States since 1982, where every cent collected in federal taxes has not been enough to pay the interest on the loans received from the Federal Reserve. So guess what? They borrow more money from the Federal Reserve to pay the interest on the loans they had. And of course it's an increasing amount. So the true magnitude of the US debt alone is estimated to be $112 trillion. Now, just to put that in perspective, that's about 5 times the planetary GDP, the total gross domestic product of the planet. So in other words, I mean, it ain't going to be recoverable anytime soon. And a classic example of how these guys get a extremely well-balanced financially well-balanced country into its clutches is this. Recognise that? I lived in Dubai between end of 1990 and 1993, before it started to become the outrageous edifice that it is today. I lived there during the rule of Sheikh Mohammed Al Maktoum. But he died earlier this decade, and he was succeeded by his son, Sheikh Mohammed bin Al Maktoum. And whilst his father was an extremely astute player, and he grew the Dubai economy from nothing based on the revenues that he got from the offshore oil, and he developed a balanced economy by building the Dubai dry docks, the Jebel Ali container port, turning Dubai into the new Beirut. It became a financial centre in the Middle East, became a hub for all the oil industry in the Middle East. In fact, Halliburton have their headquarters there now, the second headquarters, the main one's in China. It then moved into tourism, the golf courses, the offshore powerboat racing, and now Formula One racing. Well, the World Bank came along to the son of Al Maktoum and said, you know, your dad did a great job in building the economy, but how would you like to leave your mark on the country? Such a mark that it could be seen from outer space. And they presented him with this project. The project wasn't dreamed up in Dubai. The project was dreamed up by the World Bank and the IMF. And so they presented the project to him, and he said, well, you know, it's an interesting project, I like the idea, but, you know, it's a bit of a stretch on our finances. I've got a few other projects in mind. And they said, oh, don't worry about that. We'll lend you the money. And unfortunately, he bought into it hook, line and sinker. And of course, this isn't the only part of the project, because over here, just on the northwest side of that, is a bunch of islands in the shape of the world. That project isn't finished, will never be finished, and the islands are actually washing back into the sea. So this part of the project was finished, and all these luxury villas were built on these islands, the palm fronds here and hotels down here, when the global economy crashed. So you had no possibility of selling these islands and the real estate on them. So the World Bank said, oh, you've got a bit of a problem, haven't you? Because you owe us a shed load of money. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And they said, well, what have you got? Oh, gosh, you've got oil. You've got oil. How about we take over a significant chunk of your oil futures? Well, he nearly got suckered into that. But his neighbour, the son of Sheikh Zayed in Abu Dhabi, was a little bit more astute. He'd actually warned him about this, about the fact that he was being lured into a financial trap. But Sheikh Zayed came to the rescue and offered him the money to get the World Bank and the IMF off his back. You know, one of the things that all of those countries that are demonised in the media as the axis of evil, you know, the countries like Venezuela, Libya, state of flux at the moment, of course, formerly Iraq, Iran, North Korea, they all have one thing in common. You know what that is? They're all free of debt from the World Bank. And the World Bank doesn't like it because the World Bank can't control them. That's why there's a war on terror and a quest to put democracy in all around the world, because actually democracy is the easiest political system to manipulate, as you're about to find out. Well, don't just take this from me. I've got a short clip, and then we're going to take, I think, a 15-minute break, so you're not sitting around too long, and then we'll get into some real meat. I'm going to show you a short clip of a presentation by a guy who used to work for the World Bank. And his job was to go around the world to targeted countries, normally developing nations, and particularly developing nations that had a leader. And of course, in a developing nation, they were normally a dictator. But funnily enough, most of them were benign and benevolent dictators, and they actually had an interest in their people. Because actually, they'd worked out, if they didn't, then they probably wouldn't be in power for too much longer. Now, that doesn't apply to all dictators, of course, because some get a bit carried away. But this guy was specifically targeted to the benign dictators, and his job was to persuade them to buy into these type of infrastructure projects to get the countries into debt. And he knew that if he wasn't successful, then, as you'll hear him say in the clip, he knew that the World Bank would send in the jackals, as he called them. The jackals. And the first part of the exercise would be to try and undermine that leader. But if that didn't work, then the leader would be taken out. He would be killed, normally in a light plane crash or a helicopter crash. Now, about 20 years ago, in the early 90s, this particular individual, whose name is John Perkins, decided that he couldn't do this anymore. He had a bad attack of conscience. So he decided he was going to write a book about his experiences. Well, the World Bank and the IMF actually must have held this guy in quite high regard, because they didn't put him on a plane and bring the plane down. What they did was they heard that he was planning to write a book, and they paid him $1 million a year to do nothing, as long as he didn't write his book. And all he had to do was turn up at a few court cases around the world and act as a specialist witness. But when 9/11 went down, he knew that 9/11 was a construct, because he worked in that arena. And that was his line in the sand, and he decided that the book had to go into the public domain. That book is called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And I'm going to recommend 2 or 3 books during the course of the evening, and that is one which you really need to read, because these guys have been sent and they've been working very well in Ireland. Of course, they targeted Mr. Burke, but more of that later. So let's take a look at this clip. This is John Perkins. By the way, any guesses as to what John Perkins is doing right now? Right this moment, he's working as an advisor to the Icelandic government.
Funny thing going on here. I currently work for this company called Charles C. Mayo in Boston. And I went and I took the job. And then I was trained by this amazing woman named Claudine, who's described in detail in the books. She was very intelligent, very cunning, very seductive. She knew all my weaknesses and used them all, and as a hook. And she also told me what economic hitmen do, what I would be expected to do. And in essence, what we do, what we've done since World War II on an increasing basis, is to create the world's first truly global empire. And we've done it primarily without the military, through economics, through economic hitmen. And the way we work many ways, but perhaps the most common is that we will identify a third world country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil. And then we arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. But the money never goes to the country. It goes to our big corporations like Bechtel across the water here. We're on that side of the water, aren't we? They go to our big corporations that build huge infrastructure projects in this country, power plants, industrial parks, highways and ports, things that benefit a few very rich people, as well as our own corporations, but don't help the majority of the people, because the majority of the people are not connected to the electrical grid. They don't have the skills to get jobs in industrial parks, and they don't get to use the highways or the ports. But this country is left holding a huge debt, and this is by intention. So huge you can't possibly repay it. So at some point we go back and say, you owe us a lot of money, can't pay your debt, give us a pound of flesh, sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies, vote with us on the next critical UN vote, send troops to Iraq in support of ours. Most people in the United States seem to believe that these troops that went to Iraq from other countries went in support of Iraq. They didn't. Almost all of them went because they were blackmailed. Their countries were blackmailed into sending them. And in this way, we created this empire. When we economic hitmen fail, which isn't very often, I failed in Panama with Omar Torrijos and in Ecuador with Jaime Roldos. I couldn't corrupt these two presidents, couldn't bring them around. And when we fail, the next step is to send in the jackals. And these are men who overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders. Both Omar Torrijos and Jaime Roldos were assassinated by CIA-sponsored jackals because I failed in my job.
You get the idea? Yeah? Now, on the basis that Brian Cowan, Bertie Ahern, Charles Hockey, they're still alive, what would you conclude from that? Yeah? The only people that got taken out or forcibly removed were those they couldn't corrupt in any way, shape or form. Those dictators demonized in the media because they couldn't be corrupted. Okay, we're going to take a 15-minute break so that you can stretch your legs, have a smoke, have a drink, and then we're going to focus on what's going on in Ireland and what we can do about it. Thank you very much.